Strange but true stories. Tales from the light side, the dark side, and the other side. I'm Steve White. Actually, this episode may be more like Tales from the smelly side because once again we dive into the world of the Sasquatch. That creature is apparently in desperate need of a long hot shower and a fresh bar of soap because one of the distinctive elements of a Bigfoot sighting, or maybe that should be smelling, is the pungent foul odor. And apparently, as is the case in each of today's stories, not a big fan of dogs, at least as pets. This experience chilled me to the core. I still have PTSD from it and have trouble going into the woods or being in the dark at night outside. I see the creature and the experience in my dreams and feel as if something is always behind me or watching me. I was 14 years old and living in northern New Jersey when this happened. I signed up in summer for a camp that took us out hiking to different trails around the state. We had chaperones, and about 15 kids would go on each hike to each location. My encounter happened in Bear Mountain State Park. This is around an area called a High Point Wilderness Area. It runs through Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania. An hour into the hike, me and a friend of mine decided to sneak off the trail to smoke a cigarette. We made it off the trail enough to not see the others and started to light up when we heard a noise to our left. Above us, to the left, was a small ridge. It sounded like something was walking parallel to us on that ridge, then stopped in a thick growth. And we didn't pay much attention to it other than to know somebody or something else was there. We just thought maybe it was another hiker or something like that. I had my back to the ridge and my friend was facing me, and we were enjoying the cigarettes. Well, really more the idea that we were away from the group on our own doing something we knew might get us in trouble. We were talking and laughing when he looked up towards that ridge, and a look of terror came across my friend's face. He literally jolted, and then he bolted away from me, leaving me in the dust. He hadn't said anything about what had caused him to run. Was it a camp counselor who had caught us in the act? Another judgmental adult? I slowly turned, really not understanding what was happening, and my eyes fixed, and I froze. There in front of me, no more than 10 feet away from me, was an enormous gray monster. I know now that it was a Sasquatch, but at the time I thought of it only as a monster. People talk about the size of these things and say, oh, it was 7 feet tall. Some of my observations could have been skewed due to my young age and smaller size. But when I tell you it was enormous, I mean it was enormous. This thing was not 7 feet tall. My dad was 6'3". This thing would have dwarfed him, like Peter Dinklage compared to Shaquille O'Neal. This thing had to be 9 feet tall and half again as thick. Muscles I've never been able to fathom in my life since that day, no matter how many pictures of a Bigfoot I see. Its shoulders and chest were like boulders. I was so scared I didn't want to look at its face. I just couldn't. I was terrified. I finally, slowly looked up and looked immediately down. Its face was contorted into a grimace, and it looked so weird, so scary. Just ape-like, but more sinister, teeth showing. I could not focus or breathe. Even worse, in its left hand, it held half of a dog. Yep, the poor dog had been ripped in half, dried blood on the extremities and torso area where it was ripped clean. The creature held it by its neck, its hand fitting fully around it, almost making it disappear. Its right hand held some type of article of clothing or a blanket. It also appeared to have blood on it. This part is so hazy due to the trauma and fear that I still cannot clearly remember every subsequent step. All I know is that I finally gathered the courage and the strength to run. I don't think I've ever run as fast as I did at that moment. I could have won the Olympic 100 meters as fast as I was moving. I ran back in the direction of the hiking group. They had paused on the trail to rest and have lunch. When I reached them, I turned around to see if the creature had pursued me. I didn't see or hear it anywhere near. My friend was sitting by himself, pale and obviously traumatized. The rest of the kids were eating their lunch and didn't seem too concerned about us. I was light on my feet, almost unable to walk steadily. I got vertigo and could not believe that what I had just seen and experienced was real. I had no idea what to think or what I was doing. I thought I'd seen a monster. That's the only way to describe it. My friend and I managed to finish the hike with our group that day, but going into the woods alone was a thing of the past. The encounter did lead to my obsession with Sasquatch, and despite the sleepless nights and horrific mind games my brain would play with me over the next 10 years, I could not ever stop thinking about that day. It was too terrifying. I just stopped going out into the woods. Even though it didn't hurt either of us, I cannot seem to shake the feeling that these things are more dangerous than people think. I move back and forth between obsession, extreme interest, and a need to research, to pure terror and isolation, trying to never think about the beast, and especially not go out into the field. I know I'll never be able to erase this event from my psyche and erase the image I saw that day from my head. Once something like this happens to you, it changes your worldview completely. Recently, we received another email from a longtime SBT viewer about a Sasquatch-like creature that he remembered hearing about when he was a teenager. He wrote to us saying, "I'm 57 years old and a deputy sheriff for over 20 years in the Kansas City area. In the early 1970s, there were stories or legends or whatever about a monster in Kansas City, mostly on the Kansas side. If it was in Kansas City, Missouri, I didn't hear of it. Anyway, supposedly there were sightings from time to time of Bigfoot, a Sasquatch-like creature roaming the area. It was called the Momo, which is short for Missouri Monster. There's a park close to where I grew up. I'd heard someone had seen a black bear down there, but I didn't believe that. I have never seen a bear in the wild around here. We have foxes, coyotes, and an occasional bobcat. And near the river and a little further north, some cougars, but no bears. I was around 14 years old when the stories were prevalent. The word would get out that the Momo was out and everyone in the neighborhood would stay in the house. I had a girlfriend at that time, and man, let me tell you, she was pretty. In fact, she was the prettiest girl in KC. Now, anytime a monster sighting came up and the word spread, she would not leave her house. I would get so mad. I mean, come on, there's no such thing as a Momo Bigfoot, for crying out loud. A few decades later, I'm a deputy sheriff. I was at a gas station on the Missouri side when I saw a business truck with a name the same as a good friend of mine, a friend who left the department suddenly and never looked back. The name is very unique and unusual, so I asked the man pumping the gas if he happened to be related to my friend. He answered, "Well, it depends on who's asking." I told him my name and that I had worked with the former detective and would like to give him my contact info. Well, while I was pumping my gas, he called his brother, who was more than happy to hear from me. We talked for a good while and told me to hand the phone back to his brother and wait a minute. He spoke to him, and I heard him say, "Are you sure?" "If you say so." When he hung the phone up, he related this story to me. Back in the early 70s, when he and his brother were police officers, he was dispatched on a call of a woman being attacked by a man in her home. When he and his partner arrived on the scene, it wasn't a man, and it wasn't a monkey. He says this thing was taller than 6 feet, and it was attempting to climb out of a window when they got there. But there were bars on the outside of the window preventing its escape. They had it at gunpoint, but were really wondering what it actually was. The officers looked at each other, asking, "What the?" At that instant, the creature bolted past them out the door and ran toward the river, which was about a block away from the house. He was very serious. They told their story back at the precinct, but They were mocked and teased by their fellow officers, but he swore on his mother's grave that that is what they saw. There were other reports around the city about a strange, hairy creature lurking in the area. Several citizens had filed reports. Maybe my beautiful former girlfriend probably saved my behind in the 70s because she wouldn't come outside when the monster was out. That kept me inside too. I've heard since of many encounters in the area. Recently, a young friend of mine who was an avid hunter relayed to me that he and his dad were driving down a road in nearby Peculiar, Missouri, and saw a 9-foot brown Bigfoot walk into the woods in broad daylight. Until then, he was a mocker of cryptid believers. Now, I personally haven't seen one, but I don't want to either. So ends the email sent to us by the deputy, but that did get us wondering about this so-called Momo, so we looked into it a little bit, and it turns out the Momo sightings inspired a song, a low-budget and apparently not very good horror film, several documentaries, and a few books. So here's the story of the Missouri Monster. In July 1971, Joan Mills and her friend Mary Ryan were driving their Volkswagen Beetle along Highway 79 north of Louisiana, Missouri, about 90 miles northwest of St. Louis. Highway 79 runs parallel to the Mississippi River, and they were searching for a spot to have a picnic. They eyed a spot and turned down a dirt road to a scenic location to enjoy the day. They spread out their blanket, placed the basket on top, and spread out their food, soaking in the beautiful view they had selected as they ate. Then they both noticed a peculiar odor wafting on the wind. Mary remembered thinking she had never smelled anything so bad in her life. Was it a skunk? A whole family of skunks? With noses wrinkled on their grimaced faces, they looked around to see if they could spot the source of the smell. It was Joan who spotted movement in a brushy thicket behind them. She pointed in that direction and saw the top part of an unusual-looking creature staring down at them. She couldn't take her eyes off of the creature, and she says she got a very good look. Mary looked in that direction and later described what she saw in the weeds staring at them. She was quoted as saying it was half ape and half man. I've been reading up on the abominable snowman since then, and from stories and articles, you get the idea that these things are more like gorillas. This thing was not like that at all. It had hair over the body as if it was an ape. Yet the face was definitely human. It was more like a hairy human. And then, according to Joan, the creature made a little gurgling sound, like someone trying to whistle underwater. The creature stepped out of the thicket and began walking on two legs towards the women. The women jumped up, raced to their car, jumped in, locked the doors, and tried to get moving. But Joan realized she had left the car key in her purse, still resting on the picnic blanket. The hairy beast approached the car, caressed the smooth hood, and then attempted to open the passenger side door. Mary, sitting in the passenger seat, got an even better look at the creature as it tried to open the locked door. She said the arms dangled way down and were partially covered with hair, but the hands and palms were hairless. We had plenty of time to see this. Joan started hitting the horn ring, and the sound caused the creature to jump back and move away from the car. She laid on the horn as the creature continued to retreat. Sensing that the horn wasn't a threat, the Sasquatch-like creature paused at their picnic. Mary said it picked up my peanut butter sandwich, smelled it, then devoured it in one gulp. It started to pick up Joan's purse, dropped it, and then disappeared back into the woods. Joan jumped out of the car to retrieve her purse, leaving the blanket, the picnic basket, and the food behind, got back in the car, and sped off back to St. Louis. It took them a little over an hour to travel the 90 miles back, and once there, went to the Missouri State Patrol office to file a report. The report was accepted, but both women received incredulous looks from the officers who read it. There was no confirmation the event was ever looked into, and it would be a year before another eyewitness account would confirm that they weren't crazy. On June 30th, 1972, Two guys were fishing on the Quiver River in Troy, about 50 miles northwest of the center of St. Louis. They found a spot on a high bank that overlooked the river and a lower bank on the opposite side. The fish, they weren't biting that well that day, and Vaughn decided to stretch his legs a little, take a break. He stood up, placed his hands on his lower back, and leaned back a bit, taking in a large gulp of fresh country air. Only, it didn't smell very fresh. In fact, the air he was smelling was downright putrid. The breeze was blowing in his face from across the river, and when he looked in that direction, he noticed something emerge from a thicket on the opposite bank of the river. Vaughn chuckled a little at the sight, thinking that what he was looking at was a long-haired, naked hippie. Man, that guy had a lot of hair. He was covered in it. He hollered over to his friend, Tim, to take a look at the hairy hippie who must be on the Acapulco Gold or the Maui Wowie to walk around like that. And when was the last time this dude had a bath? Yeesh. Back to nature is one thing, but dude, plants must be wilting downwind of you. But when Tim saw the hairy dude, he knew it wasn't a hippie. It wasn't even a man. For one, this creature was taller than any normal man and much hairier than anything he'd ever seen. There was hair covering its entire body. It didn't appear to have a neck. Vaughn and Tim crept a little closer to the river's edge to get a better look. And that's when the beast turned its head and saw them. It charged them. Vaughn and Tim turned heel and ran as fast as they could go, fearing for their safety. They jumped in their car, leaving all their fishing gear behind, and raced to report their story. They spoke of a creature with a large, pumpkin-shaped head and incredibly furry body with the black hair looking like a shaggy rug hanging off of it. They thought it was about 7 feet tall and smelled like rotting garbage. When they returned to the area to gather their fishing equipment, they searched around the area for any indication the creature had been there and found several three-toed footprints. All was quiet for about 2 weeks, and then another report of a large, hairy creature came in. On July 11th, 1972, 8-year-old Terry Harrison and his 5-year-old brother Wally were outside playing in their backyard. Their house was nestled at the base of Marzoff Hill. July 11th was a typical hot July day in Louisiana, Missouri. Now remember, Louisiana, Missouri is where the first sighting of the Momo happened a year prior. Terry and Wally's sister Doris was inside when she heard her two brothers begin screaming simultaneously. Now, there isn't anything all that unusual about two young boys screaming and playing in the backyard, but it was the nature of the scream that caused Doris to look out the bathroom window into the yard and see what was causing the commotion. Standing by a tree at the edge of their yard stood a huge, hairy creature. She said it was 6 or 7 feet tall with black hair draping its entire body. It had 2 brightly glowing orange eyes. But what was even scarier was what it was holding. In its grasp was the bloody corpse of one of the neighborhood dogs. Thankfully, it wasn't their dog, Chubby, who also had heard the screams and was barking at the creature from a distance. Doris recalled later to the St. Louis Times-Dispatch, "It stood like a man, but it didn't look like one to me." She ran to the phone and called her mother to tell her to come home immediately. She hung up and then went to the back door to tell the boys to come inside. When Terry, a red-haired, fair-skinned, multi-freckled boy, came inside, Doris noticed his face was so white from what he had seen, she couldn't see a single freckle. This all happened on a Tuesday afternoon. A week later, the phone was still ringing at the local police station with more reports coming in. Some reported hearing and smelling the creature, but not seeing it. They recounted hearing the gurgling growls and smelling the horrific putrid stench as they searched for it in the neighborhood. A 56-year-old gas station attendant was one of the folks who did some searching around the Marzoff Hill area soon after the reports started coming in. He said, "The odor is worse than any old goat that you ever smelled. Its growl is like a bear's, but a bear doesn't run on 2 feet." Police Chief Shelby Ward was called out of bed numerous times to go up on the hill to investigate things people were hearing. He eventually put a small posse together and combed the area. After making 3 passes up and down the hill, finding nothing, he said, "I hope this ends it." A few days later, another report came in from a husband and wife traveling from West Virginia. They didn't have any knowledge of the earlier reports of a strange, hairy, man-like creature. They were just passing through when they stopped at the Logan Conservation Area in northern Lincoln County, Missouri, to rest and stretch. When they opened their door and climbed out of their car, they both smelled a horrible, pungent odor. They described it as a family of skunks as well. They spun around and saw the glowing eyes and the large pumpkin-shaped head and the stringy-haired covered body of the creature. They again described it as 7 feet tall and had to be at least 400 pounds. The creature lurched toward them. They were able to pile back into their car, but spent long, agonizing minutes staring into its face as it rocked their car back and forth. It was powerful, and it took some time for it to tire out, but finally it did. It left them alone again as it wandered off into the woods. Momo mania was now in full force, leading to a gaggle of investigators coming to the area. There were the Sasquatch enthusiasts, ufologists, and news reporters flocking to the area to look around and see if they could find any evidence. SEMA investigator Hayden Hughes interviewed the witnesses and found them to be credible. He did not think the Momo monster was a hoax, but he also did not believe it had anything to do with UFO activity. But there were many in the area that thought it was all a bunch of bunk. Glenn Walker was a local taxi driver that thought the whole thing was a bunch of malarkey. He was quoted as saying, "You can put out one word right here, and by the time he gets around the block, you've got a dictionary." And yet, the stories persist. This has been another edition of Strange But True Stories. Time to tell us what you think. Are there Sasquatch creatures or a big Momo roaming the earth? There have been reports on 6 continents, all but Antarctica. Was the Momo a figment of people's imaginations? Or was there something to it? The stories continue to linger, with many still hearing accounts of the smelly, hairy Momo creature wandering the woods of Missouri. Let us know in the comments below. And if you have a story you would like to share with us about something unusual, paranormal happening to you, send it to us in an email to strangebutTrueStories2@gmail.com. Thanks for all your support. We appreciate the patience in waiting for these episodes. We're not done yet. We've got lots more stories to tell about this crazy place we call home. Thanks for listening to this episode. I'm Steve White. Until next time.